Hey everyone, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're tackling a really intense, highly debated historical question. What was the actual economic reality of Nazi Germany? It's one of those topics where political rhetoric constantly collides with hard historical data. Was it a socialist system? Was it capitalist? Or was it something else entirely? We're going to rely strictly on the historical record and economic analyses to figure this out. To keep things completely objective, we'll map out the source material across 5 key areas. Number 1, the name and the tactics. 2, crushing unions. 3, mass privatization. 4, the socialism by stealth argument. And 5, a state-centric war economy. Okay, so look at this question. It immediately highlights the central, kind of glaring historical contradiction we're exploring today. How on earth does a party with the word socialist right there in its name get historically credited with coining the concept of mass privatization? Section 1, the name and the tactics. Let's start with the elephant in the room here. The sources show us that adding socialist to their name was an incredibly calculated political maneuver. See, the party originally started out as just the German Workers' Party, or DAP, but in 1920 they rebranded to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Why to do that? Well, post-World War I Germany was completely fractured politically. They needed to tactically use that National Socialist name to draw workers away from communist uprisings, right? But they also needed to appeal to the right-wing Völkisch nationalists. So it was a bait and hook. They combined socialist and workers to bait the left and used national and German to hook the right. And what's wild is that Hitler actually just came right out and admitted this. He explicitly said he co-opted the terminology for nationalist goals. In 1934, when he was asked about prioritizing the worker over the bourgeoisie, he outright stated he chose the word to, quote, recapture this word for the national force, unquote, and prevent it from having an international Marxist vibe. So yeah, it was a tactical rebranding, absolutely not an economic commitment. Moving on to Section 2, crushing unions and collective bargaining. Let's see how that rhetoric actually translated for the working class once the regime took power. Despite slapping Workers' Party on their posters, the state rapidly dismantled independent labor rights. They were building a social order strictly in tune with their own ideology. In May 1933, they just banned all pre-existing trade unions. Gone. Free collective bargaining? Abolished. They replaced them with the state-controlled German Labor Front, or DAF. But the DAF was not there to protect workers. Its stated goal was literally just to increase output. Strikes were strictly outlawed. And it gets worse. By 1935, they introduced labor books. Get this, you couldn't even quit your job and get hired somewhere else without the consent of your previous employer. The real-world impact of those subjugating policies was brutal. To put a number on it, real wages in Germany actually plummeted by roughly 25% between 1933 and 1938. So that essential Marxist idea of the working class controlling the means of production, it was entirely absent. The workers were, in reality, heavily suppressed. Section 3, the era of mass privatization. So if the workers didn't control things, who actually owned the means of production? Well, this brings us to a fascinating divergence in history. During the Great Depression, the rest of the Western world was actually increasing state ownership. Think of FDR's New Deal in the US. But the Nazi government did the exact opposite. They applied privatization en masse. In fact, the term privatization itself was coined specifically to describe exactly what the Nazi economy was doing in the 1930s. And the sheer scale of this was off the charts. The regime sold off colossal state assets. We're talking about privatizing the 4 major commercial banks, including Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank. Over in heavy industry, they sold off United Steelworks, which was the second largest joint stock company in all of Germany. They even sold off shares in German Railways, the largest single public enterprise in the world at the time. Why? To raise massive funds for military spending and to cement incredibly lucrative partnerships with corporate monopolies like Krupp and IG Farben. Those companies supported the regime, and in return, they got advantageous contracts and a totally suppressed workforce. Now, the absolutely crucial point here is why they maintained private property. It wasn't because they loved free market democratic ideals. No, it was based on a brutal ideology of social Darwinism. Hitler argued that bureaucratic management would just preserve the weak, and that private property created incentives for efficiency and technical progress. Progress they thought was necessary for the nation to conquer others. It was a form of capitalism, sure, but completely stripped of free market liberalism and heavily directed toward military aims and strict racial hierarchy. All right, Section 4, the socialism by stealth argument.
To make sure we're fairly examining all the economic perspectives from our sources, we have to look at a prominent Austrian economic counter-argument.
So while privatization was rampant early on, the economy did begin to shift. To fund their massive military rearmament and public works projects, the regime relied heavily on inflationary deficit spending. By 1936, this inflation was a massive threat to the economy, which forced the government to pivot. They implemented the four-year plan and slapped down strict price and wage controls.
Economic theorists, particularly from the Mises Institute, argue that these 1936 price and wage controls fundamentally changed the whole nature of ownership. They argue this actually created a German pattern of socialism, where the state effectively controlled production, even though on paper it was still privately owned.
So technically, property and profits remained in private hands. But the socialism by stealth argument says, hey, if the state dictates what you produce, exactly how much you produce, and exactly what you charge for it, do you really own your property, or does the state? The Mises Institute points out that maintaining this kind of dynamic required a massive totalitarian police apparatus just to enforce the economic controls. It essentially turned the peaceful pursuit of self-interest into a literal criminal offense.
Section 5, a state-centric war economy. Let's pull all this together and see how historians synthesize these conflicting arguments into a clinical historical consensus. When modern historians look back at this era, they generally reject the idea that it fits neatly into a box of pure socialism or pure capitalism. Historian Richard Overy points out it was a mixed economy, sitting somewhere between the communist command economy of the Soviet Union and the market economy of the United States. Scholars widely describe it as a dirigist economy, which essentially just means it was state-directed. Thinkers from the Frankfurt School who were observing this as it actually happened in the mid-20th century noted that the regime completely defied the traditional debate of free market versus planned economy. The real historical consensus points to its status as a state-centric war economy, or a form of state capitalism, that was rooted entirely in racial hierarchy rather than any sort of class-based equality. Private business absolutely thrived, for sure, but only as long as it served the state's supreme goal, which was military expansion. If a business leader didn't cooperate, they were out. But if they played ball, they were rewarded with monopolies and massive state contracts. And honestly, nothing highlights the horrific reality of this system more than the labor statistics themselves. By 1944, a full quarter of the German civilian workforce, 25%, was made up of slave labor drawn from concentration camps and conquered territories. Major household name corporations utilized hundreds of thousands of these prisoners. This absolutely was not an economy built on socialist workers' rights. And it wasn't built on capitalist free market competition either. It was an economy built from the ground up on conquest, subjugation, and plunder. So that brings us to the ultimate question this explainer leaves us with. If a regime uses private enterprise and crushing labor suppression just to fuel a totalitarian war machine, does it truly fit the definition of either capitalism or socialism? It really challenges us to look way beyond the tactical labels that politicians choose for themselves and instead deeply examine the actual horrifying economic mechanisms of history. Because by understanding how a state can manipulate both private property and state control for totalitarian ends, we become a lot better equipped to see past the rhetoric of the past and maybe even the rhetoric of the present. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. And remember, always keep questioning what you read.